Okay, David, we've heard about the start of Paul's missionary activity, the so-called first missionary journey when he was on Cyprus and then in Asia Minor, culminating in the account of the Jerusalem Conference and the decision to allow Gentiles into this movement without becoming Jews. And now we have, in this next couple of chapters, 16 and 17, the bulk of what counts as Paul's second missionary journey to Philippi.
Right.
And there he does a number of things, including to convert a woman named Lydia. What do you make of her, and what do you make of that conversion?
Well, what strikes me is that in some ways, as is the case in Paul's letters, you have a sense that women have some importance in the early Pauline community. She's clearly a person of some substance because we heard not only about her but about her household. We don't know many of the details of her life, but I think in some ways it's consistent with what we see in some of the letters where Paul clearly will greet women or talk about women. We've talked about Philippians, you and I, together before, and the whole purpose of Philippians is to work out some kind of dispute in the church, and it seems to be related to a dispute between two women leaders, Euodia and Syntyche, who are clearly important enough that their dispute brings distress on the whole congregation. So I think Acts begins to mirror that sense that the right reminiscence that women had an important part in the early Christian communities.
And do you remember where Lydia is from originally?
Thyatira, as I remember it.
Yeah, where do we hear about that?
Book of Revelation.
Yeah, do you think there's any connection here?
I have no idea.
It'd be interesting.
Yeah, well, yeah. If we invited to do one on Revelation, we'll look at that and see if Thyatira was purple in those days.
Do you think that people like Lydia play a role in the pages of Luke analogous to the role played by the women in Paul's actual life?
I'm better thinking about that with the Gospel of Luke than I am with Acts, because I've been influenced by a woman named Sharon Ringy, who teaches in Washington, D.C., and who wrote the commentary we used in this series on Acts, in fact, and says that women are important but subordinate consistently, that the Mary and Martha story in Luke is kind of a paradigm of the role that women have in Luke and Acts, which is they're welcome to serve and they're welcome to listen, but they're not in the same way leaders of the church that they really seem to be in some of Paul's writings. In Paul's writings, one gets a sense that these are apostles and ministers and deacons and important leading figures in the church, not simply servant figures.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and that would comport with what Lydia does here. She provides hospitality.
She does, exactly.
She doesn't go out and preach.
Yeah.
And the next woman we meet in the next episode is a slave girl.
Not so good, right? Yeah.
Who needs to be delivered from her
being
possession.
Possessed.
Yeah.
Though, as often the case in Luke's gospel, the slave girl says the right things for the wrong reasons. That is, right? She claims the two of them as being, what's the word in there? She's got it. Anyway, claims for them their role as who proclaim to you the way of salvation. Slaves of the Most High God who proclaim the way of salvation. That's true.
Right.
They are that, but she's saying it for the wrong reason under a spirit of divination, so she has to be exorcised.
Right.
Yeah.
And then we have another episode where we have an imprisonment and some rather remarkable escape from that status.
Yeah.
And as part of that whole episode, we learn that Paul, at least, and probably Barnabas, are Roman citizens.
Yes.
What do you make of that claim, Luke?
Well, there clearly was a category of people in that time who became citizens of Rome not because they had grown up as kind of Italians, but who in various ways were brought into the Roman Empire. And one of those ways was through the citizenship bestowed on certain freedmen, and then apparently on their heirs as well. And we'll see later that one of the jailers, I think, contrasts himself to Paul by saying he bought his citizenship and Paul just got his, which makes me think that Paul may well have inherited this through the family. And it becomes very important because those who imprison Paul are not allowed to treat him as a Roman citizen as they would were he simply a kind of
non-Roman citizen.
A non-Roman citizen,
Right.
Right.
Yeah, so that might be a historical detail.
So that might be a historical detail
Luke has right.
It also fits, I think, one of the concerns we've seen all along, which is, I think, on the whole, this book is written to help Christians feel good about Rome and Rome feel good about Christians. And if you see our key figure already lives in both worlds, then the kind of contrast between being Roman and being Christian diminishes.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, that certainly will become important in the latter.
It becomes very important toward the end
of Acts. Okay, so they move on beyond Philippi and move to Thessalonica, another city in Macedonia. And there they do what Paul usually does when he goes into a place. He starts his evangelistic activity. What does that look like?
Well, he starts with the synagogue and then tends not to be accepted very well there, and then moves on to the larger community. And in a way, I think, I'd love to get your response to this. As I was thinking about this to get ready for our conversation, it's almost a kind of miniature version of what happens in the whole Gospel of Acts, that you start with Jerusalem and move to Rome. You start with a synagogue, move to the Gentile community, start with Peter preaching to Jews, end with Paul preaching to Gentiles in Acts 17. It reflects, one, maybe very historically accurate. Two, I think reflects kind of the movement of the way the God Spirit is starting with Israel but not ending with Israel. And maybe we'll see when we get to chapter 28, saying that's over. I don't know. That's harder.
Yeah, that is, but it's part of a pattern.
It's part of a
that's
pattern,
clear.
sure. Yeah.
And whether Paul's practice was as schematic and as systematic.
Yeah,
as
no,
Luke
exactly.
portrays
It works
it's
great for Luke's
entirely clear,
purposes.
Yeah. One interesting little tidbit in Thessalonica, obviously there's a little bit of a disturbance when Paul and his friends start to preach. And the folk react and say, these people are turning the world upside down. This is in 17:6.
Yeah, and then go on to say that they think there's another king named Jesus.
So what do you make of this in the larger framework of Luke's apologetic?
Quick aside, I've just been reading the biography of George Washington, and the story is that when the British surrendered at Yorktown, they played a tune on their pipes and drums called The World Turned Upside Down. And it's a little bit of that. He who was king is king no longer. And I think Luke's in a tricky position. He wants to say that the true king is Jesus. On the other hand, he wants to say that's not really a threat to Caesar. Because you can't worship Caesar, but you can live with Caesar. And I suspect this is one of those little passages where you're trying to play both those things off each other. Yes, the world is turned upside down, but don't get too worried, Governor. We're not actually going to come and take over the fortress.
It's a little bit analogous, I think, to what we were talking about in one of our early conversations on the book of Acts on the issue of wealth and poverty.
Yeah.
Where Luke articulates
That's
the position
very nice.
that, in its ideal form.
In ideal form, the world is totally turned upside down. In the time between, till Christ comes to reign in victory, we kick the world around a little bit, but we're not yet quite in the revolutionary mode.
Yeah, it reminds me of the Magnificat, the mighty have been
Yeah,
put
yeah,
down
yeah,
from
yeah.
their thrones.
Yeah.
But they haven't.
But not quite yet.
Yeah, right,
Yeah,
right.
right.
So Luke is hedging his bets a little bit.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So Paul's itinerary takes him through Macedonia, Philippi, Thessalonica, as we can reconstruct in his epistles,
Right.
and next to Athens.
Yeah.
And this is a very interesting episode, isn't it? Where he
This
comes
is, I think, hugely important. It's the only extended speech in Acts where Paul doesn't presuppose a certain amount of scriptural knowledge on the part of those who are listening to him, but assumes that these are people whose background, whose sociology of knowledge does not include being steeped in the Hebrew scriptures. And so he draws on things that they would know as opposed to trying to draw on his own Pharisaic background.
Right. Luke characterizes them in Acts 17:18 as Epicurean and Stoic philosophers who are debating with Paul.
Yeah.
Do you think that this speech that is attributed to Paul really addresses Stoic and Epicurean
Oh,
concerns?
you're much better at this than I am. I think I hear in the first part of it about the creator of the world and the way in which we can somehow know that God through our own knowledge. It's certainly kind of Stoic echoes. I'm much less clear about whether there's direct Epicurean echoes, and I'm much less clear about whether Paul is saying these are kind of card-carrying Epicurean and Stoics, or if it's kind of here are two big philosophical groups at the time. These are just thinking people. What do you think?
I think that they're analogous to the bumpkins of Asia Minor.
Useful.
Yes, they're stock characters.
Useful stock characters.
And there's as you say, there's a little bit of almost explicit stoicism, especially when the poet, probably Emeritus, is being cited in Acts 17:28, for we too are his offspring. The offspring of the one, or the grand spirit Zeus, or whatever. That would be something that a good Stoic could say. it's not something an Epicurean would say.
Right, right.
It's more deist than
right,
than
right.
Stoics.
Much more than the Epicureans would be, yeah.
But is this in its entirety a philosophical speech? All right, there's a kind of gesture at the beginning to a natural philosophy.
No, I think gesture is just the right word. I think what happens at the beginning, you'll all remember, is that he talks about how we are somehow constructed in God's image, and therefore idolatry can't be right because idolatry makes gods look less than we, and the God who is our God must be more than we. And there's a kind of echo in here of chapter 1 of Romans, where Paul talks about when you look around the world, if you pay attention, even though you don't have the law of Moses, you have the law written on your hearts. But it doesn't end there. He moves toward the end, toward the resurrection, which does not fit any kind of natural theology, and says that this is finally what's going to have to convict people. And I suspect, I have no idea what the historical Paul did. I think that's still often pretty good preaching. That pretty good preaching starts with people in their situation and with the kind of philosophical presuppositions with which we live, and then at the end, you still have to name Jesus and say, finally, we're not going to get there by philosophy alone.
Right. And there's a call to repentance.
And a call to repentance.
And also eschatological judgment.
And the claim that judgment is coming, and some believe and some don't, which sounds to me almost certainly pretty accurate.
Right, right. And interestingly enough, these philosophers, including someone called Dionysius the Areopagite, who becomes a fictional character later on in the history of theology,
right.
They all think that Paul is talking about some deity.
Named resurrection.
Named resurrection.
Yes, exactly. Because the Greek word for resurrection is female. Looks like you've got a male god and a female god, kind of like Isis and Osiris.
So the one interesting little twist is that these sophisticated philosophers are making a mistake very similar to the country bumpkins.
Big categorical mistake. Yep. Very nice. Yeah, once again, make the wise look foolish.
Exactly.
Romans again.
Yep.
And 1 Corinthians. Okay.